I've got a lot to cover. I want to kind of jump right into it, so you don't get the big introduction. Where's Wade at? No introduction. Like that. We good, Josh? All right. Genesis 37:2. Y'all look on the screen. You don't have to flip through all of these. I've given Josh several verses, but so you can kind of look up there and or take note. But Genesis 37:2. Follow along with me. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, now watch it, we're talking about Joseph. When he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now, take a note of that. 17 years old, he brings back a bad report about his brothers to his fathers. Now, where does your mind go? What were y'all taught when you were a kid? Is that what you were taught? Snitches get stitches? I thought they taught that in jail, Mark. That's where he learned it, yeah. All right, so that's a very important verse to remember right there. Just remember that. Now, Israel, who is Israel? Jacob. God changed Jacob's name to Israel, okay? So you had Abraham, then Isaac, and Jacob, and then he changed his name to Israel. So from now on, you're going to hear Israel, and you think of Jacob, right, the son of Isaac. Remember Jacob and Esau, okay? So Jacob's name now is Israel. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. What did we learn last week? There's a problem with that, isn't it? Favoritism, right, Charlie? He can't show you favoritism. He can't do it. All right. So, Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a very-colored tunic. Have you ever heard the story of the coat of many colors? Dolly Parton sang the song about the coat of many colors my mama made for me. Well, it's possibly, here's what I want you to remember about, there's arguments online, different theologians about what this looked like. It doesn't matter. Here's what I want you to remember. This robe that he gave Joseph was different and unique and better than what he had given his other sons. Remember the favoritism. That's what I want you to remember about the coat of many colors, okay? That it was setting Joseph apart, marking Joseph as he was the preeminent son, the favored son, the most important son to Jacob, to Israel, okay? Verse 4, watch what happens. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so what? They hated him. They could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he still had another dream, and related it to his brothers, and said, "Lo, I have had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now, pause for a second. 11 stars. There's 12 sons of Joseph, right? There's some controversy on whether Benjamin, you'll find out later at the end tonight, whether Benjamin was alive. Right here he says 11 stars. What does that tell you? Benjamin was alive. Okay? So just kind of tuck that in your little hat of, ooh, I found a neat one. They were all bowing down to me, he told them. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So right off the bat, we got a problem. Jacob shows the favoritism. Joseph is the firstborn child to Rachel, which was the one that he loved, right? That's why it's his favorite. Y'all remember when Patrick, what's his name? Richard taught you about Jacob and with Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel, but the father tricked him. So he ended up marrying Rachel's sister. He had to go work another 7 years to get the wife the woman that he really loved, which was Rachel. This is the firstborn son of Rachel, Joseph, right? So this is why he's his favorite. And then, of course, she had the other son named Benjamin. And then what happened right after she had Benjamin, she died. And where did she die? Bethlehem. Right? We see that later in the New Testament, okay? So there's a prophecy in all of that. You don't have to hang on to all that. You don't have to take notes. The more you hear this stuff, the better you will retain it, okay? So, Jacob shows favoritism. That's the first problem. He put that unique robe on him, and he showed the boys that he loved him more than them. So the brothers are jealous over the robe and the dreams. Plus, he's a snitch. That's where I put my notes. I must have been there with you. He's a snitch. Nobody likes a tattletale, do they, Priscilla? Do they tell y'all at school that still? Don't be a tatty? Yeah, see, they're still telling them in school. Don't be a tattletale. So there you go. I want you to see here with that little bit. Jacob's, man, I'm messing up tonight. There's too many J's. Joseph is not perfect. Who's perfect? Only Jesus, right? No man, even young Daniel, when we studied Daniel, he wasn't perfect. Nobody's perfect. So you're going to see this amazing story of Joseph and think, wow, Joseph is great. But right off the bat, he's quick to come back and give a bad report of his brothers to his fathers, you know. So he's got some issues too. Well, one day when they're out working in the field, they see Joseph coming to check on them in the fields. And they say, here comes this dreamer. And they say, let's throw him in a pit. And we'll tell our father that a wild beast killed him. But Reuben, the oldest son, couldn't do it. So he gets him out of the pit, or he leaves him in his pit. Well, Reuben walks away. Here comes some slave traders, right? Some Ishmaelites. And they just sold their brother to him. Instead of killing him in the pit, they took Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver, okay? Sold him, and then they go back and they tell their father, they took his robe off of Joseph, his fancy little robe. They took it off of him, put animal blood on it, and then they go back to Jacob. And they say, oh, Father, your favorite son, right, Joseph, has been killed by a wild animal. And Jacob just grieved so hard because that was the son that he loved. And so he's gone. So he thinks. Now, look at verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites, so these are the guys that got him from the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, they sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And if you haven't studied much of the Old Testament, you need to understand Egypt is like the major empire of the whole world, okay? And Pharaoh is the leader, the king. They called him Pharaoh, but he's like the king over all of Egypt. And this guy is his leader of his bodyguards. Okay, he's like the chief executioner also. So he's one of Pharaoh, the top man's top man. And Joseph comes gets sold into slavery. He goes into Egypt, and he becomes a slave to Pharaoh's right-hand guy. Now, pay attention here as we're seeing. Isn't that a miracle? Of all the places he could have went, he ends up right there in Pharaoh's near proximity, okay? Verse 3, now let's move on to chapter 39, verse 3. All of 38 is talking about Judah's sin and all of that. So chapter 39, verse 3. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. Now I put that verse in there for a reason. As we go through all of this, what you need to understand, and I'll say it again later, God is not sitting in heaven watching these events unfold. God doesn't look to the end of time and see what people choose to do and then record the story. God is causing these things to happen. You see what he put there? The master, this Egyptian, this pagan heathen guy, he saw that Yahweh was with Joseph and how Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. All right, so now follow this section here. We'll find out about how Joseph finds favor. Now, this is in verses 4 to 15. Look on the screen. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended on him, and he appointed him overseer of his house. And all that he owned he gave in his hand. Now remember, this is a slave. He just buys this slave. But he finds really good character in Joseph. He starts noticing he's a really good young man. And he's very kind and trustworthy, those kind of things. So the Egyptian guard's like, okay, well, I'm going to give this kid some responsibility. I trust him. And eventually puts him over his whole house. But God is working that. See there? God is working. He's working in the mind of that bodyguard, of that Egyptian bodyguard, to see this good young man Joseph. So God's doing all of that. Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the blessing of Yahweh was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's hand, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance. And it happened after these events that his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has given all that he owns into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" So it happened that as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. Then she seized him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went outside. Now it happened, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled outside, that she called to the men of her household, and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. Now it happened that when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." Well, what do you think happens? He gets thrown into prison. Right? Verse 21 to 23. But Yahweh was with Joseph, and extended loving kindness to him, and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. So the chief jailer gave into the hand of Joseph all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's hand, because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made to succeed. Well, isn't that something? So here he is, his father's favorite son, got the fancy robe. His brothers get jealous, throw him in a pit. Then they sell him into slavery. Then he ends up getting in a prime spot in Egypt, in the household of the chief guard, the bodyguard of the king. Well, then here comes the king's wife, and she wants to try to, be with him, lies about him. Now he finds himself in prison. So he's back and forth, right? He's up one day and he's down in the pit. Now he's up and then he's back down again. Now, as we move on through this and you see these things, I want you to really listen to this part right here. Because this is the whole thing of the Old Testament. Remember what I kept telling you about pictures. The Old Testament is pictures of things to come. And pictures of who? Jesus. Joseph is a picture of Jesus. So I want you to be listening as you're hearing this story about how they treated our Lord. Did they not lie about him and put him in jail? Right? So, watch this. While he's in prison, this guy, remember, he sees, okay, he's a good young man. He puts him over all the people in the jail, gives him this responsibility. And while he's in prison, the king gets mad. Pharaoh gets mad at his cupbearer. That's the guy that always fixes his drink. Remember, you got to be careful when you're the king. People try to poison you. So he's got a cupbearer and he's got a baker. The guy that cooks for him, the guy that fixes his drink. He gets mad at his servants, puts them in jail. So while they're in jail, not Daniel, but Joseph hears that these men, one night, they had dreams. They both have a dream. And Joseph sees that these guys are all sad-faced. So he comes to him. He goes, "Why are you so sad?" And they said, "We've had a dream and we don't know what it means." So Joseph says, "Tell me what your dream is." So they tell Joseph their dream. Joseph interprets their dream. He tells them, just like, remember, he had this vision, this dream about his brothers bowing down. Now he's in jail, and he's going to interpret these guys' dreams. So to the cupbearer, the guy that fixes his drink, he tells him, you're only going to be in here 3 days, and then you're going back to serve the king. To the other baker, he goes, you're going to be in here 3 days, and then they're going to take your head off. Right? So he interprets their dream. Well, so anyway, it comes true. The cupbearer goes back after 3 days to go back to serve Pharaoh. And Joseph says, hey man, please tell Pharaoh about me. I'm innocent. I'm innocent. I'm stuck down here in prison. Wouldn't you do that? I'm innocent. Tell him to get me out of here, you know. I've been lied on, whatever. And so he goes, okay, man, Well, he goes on. 2 years go by. The cupbearer didn't do anything, right? 2 years go by in prison. Well, Pharaoh now has a dream. And Pharaoh can't get anybody of all his wise men, now you remember the story of Daniel, can't get anybody to tell him what his dream means. Well, here comes the cupbearer. And the cupbearer says, oh, by the way, there's a Hebrew down in the jail. He told me what my dream was. Maybe he can tell you what your dream means. Well, he's like, well, go get him. So Pharaoh brings up Joseph. Now watch this, chapter 41, verse 16. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will answer concerning the welfare of Pharaoh. He's like, can you tell me what my dream is? He goes, I can't, but God can. It's a lesson for us. Never find yourself taking credit for stuff, right? I love what the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament. I never will forget it. He comes in to these people. He's seen all these amazing things, miracles, people getting saved. He's been beaten, all this. He goes, let me tell you about the things that God has done through us to the Gentiles, right? How could we take any credit? And let me tell you, the reason you're sitting in that chair tonight, there's not one thing that you can say that you did to put yourself in that chair. It is the miracle of God. Because if you start thinking, well, I've been pretty good. Remember the lesson. One little bitty bad thought, one little lie, one little gossip. Stole something when you was 3 years old, 5 years old from Kim. One little sin. And you're no different than Ted Bundy, Hitler, in God's eyes. You get that? That's how you preach the gospel to people. There is no such thing as I'm good, okay? So we want to make sure that he's saying here, this is a big point, it's not in me. God will do whatever he wants to do with Pharaoh. So here, chapter 41, look at this. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So this is what the dream is, right? You have to go back. There's 7 cows and all this kind of stuff. And it's a weird little dream, but Joseph comes in and says what it means simply is you're fixing to have 7 years of famine, and you're going to have 7 years of greatness, of good produce, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine. Okay? So watch what he does. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made you know all of this, there's no one so understanding and wise as you are. You shall be over my house. Now, as we read these next few verses, y'all remember, this dude is a Hebrew slave. And then he's been put in prison. And now watch what Pharaoh, the top man over all Egypt, says to him. You shall be over my house. And according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. And he had him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So Joseph goes from being the favorite son, boom, he's in a pit, sold into slavery. Then he's back set up high again, trusted with all the house of the guard. Then he's thrown into prison. And now he comes out of prison, and he's the second command of all of Egypt. And he's 30 years old. How do you know he's 30 years old? Glad you asked. Chapter 41, verse 46. Now Joseph was 30 years old. See, guys, I mean, this Bible study's hard, isn't it? Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and passed through all the land of Egypt. Now, what do you think this guy's thinking? He's looking back over his years, right? And here I am. I mean, he's going through all of Egypt as Pharaoh, really. He's got the signet ring on. You know, I mean, he's the king. He's the main man. Nothing, he said, can be done unless you raise your hand. That's how powerful he is. Can you? I get to thinking back, and I'm going to ask Joseph when we get to heaven. What was you thinking as you went throughout the land of Egypt? Imagine what was on his mind. Now remember, how old was he when he left home? Miss Midge was just waiting. She was just waiting. 17. So, how many years has it been that he's been gone from home? There you go. Good job. Now, so here, remember the dream. The good years are coming, and 7 years of famine. So the 7 good years coming, and Joseph had them. What did he do? You'll read the story. He had them store up all of the grain. Okay? Because he knows the 7 years of famine are coming. Joseph's father's 2 sons during this time. Who remembers their name? Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay, when you get in the New Testament, often you'll hear about the northern 10 tribes are called what? Ephraim. Okay, so that's just, we're not going to study that tonight. But guess who? Since the famine's coming, guess who's going to be out of food? The whole world, right? Which includes his brothers. All right? So here's Joseph's family way back in Canaan land, 400 miles away. Which I think is interesting. They spend 400 years in slavery. But anyway, I don't know if there's if God had something to do with that. But it's around 400 miles away. So Jacob he knows that they're out of food. So he sends his 10 sons, keeps Benjamin home, the baby of Rachel, still showing favoritism, right? He ain't learned his lesson. He sends his 10 sons to Egypt to get grain. And he keeps Benjamin, his next favorite child of Rachel, at home. Now watch this. Genesis 42, verse 6. Now Joseph was the one in power over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Remember the dream? Here it comes true. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to look at the nakedness of the land." Then they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food." Now remember, the dream he had, now we're over 20 years, okay? Because he was 13 years when he set him up. And immediately the 7 good years come. So that's been 7 years. Now the famine's come. So we're 20 plus years that he's not seen his brothers. And they haven't seen him. So from 17 to 37, a man changes a little bit, right? So they don't know who he is. I don't know for sure how he disguised himself. Maybe he put on something over his face. But anyway, they said, "No, we're not spies. We're not spies. We're just here to buy food." But Joseph makes one of the brothers stay in Egypt in prison, Simeon, the second oldest son. You leave him here in prison, and you guys go all the way back to your father. Now, he sends grain with them, okay? And he leaves their money in their bags. And he sends them all the way back. And he says, "I want you to bring the other brother all the way to me. I want to see all the brothers." Now, they don't know who this is, right? They're thinking, "Well, why do you need to see?" Right? Well, anyway, so he sends them all the way back, and they keep their money. And, there's a lot goes on through all of that. It's just a bunch of back and forth, so I kind of skipped a lot of this stuff just to remind you. Joseph, when they finally come back with Benjamin, Joseph he can't keep it in anymore. He's got all his brothers standing there in front of him, and he weeps. He just can't control the emotion anymore. He starts crying, and he says, "I'm Joseph. I'm Joseph." And he just falls on them, right? Especially Benjamin. He just loves his brothers. Well, then they go back, to get Jacob. Pharaoh says, you can go get them all. So he goes all the way back to Canaan land, 400 miles, gets Jacob. And of course, Jacob's other wives. Remember, Rachel's dead. Gets all of them, brings all of his children, all of his livestock, everything that Jacob owns. He brings it to Egypt. And he gets to see his son that he hadn't seen in over 20 years. The one he thought was dead. He gets to see his son again. And after he sees his son, Jacob dies. Then he takes him back to Canaan to bury him. And it's an interesting point. He buries him beside Leah. And his father's Isaac and Abraham. Remember, Rachel was buried in Bethlehem. But he goes back and he's buried with his fathers and beside Leah. Well, once they buried their father, Jacob, what do you think the brothers thought then? Well, now he's fixing to do the payback. Now he's going to be vengeful to us because our father's gone. So they started worrying, right? And they get scared. But here's as I wrap this up tonight, here's what the most important thing that you need to remember about the story of Joseph. After all of those years being separated, right? You see how God had his hand of protection on him. How God was using him all through that. But what does Joseph do to his brothers? That's the beautiful part of the story. Look on the screen, Genesis 50. So they're so afraid. Please, what are you going to do to us? What are you going to do to us? Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? Now, Christians, as Scott Rush says, and I love him, beloved, we are not in God's place, are we? What is the most key foundational lesson in Christianity? That we are to forgive as what? As we have been forgiven. Joseph knew this. This is not my job. Vengeance is not ours, saith the Lord, right? And that's not our job to do that. He says, am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to do what has happened on this day, to keep many people alive. So now do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke to their heart. And Joseph goes on, lives to be 110, and they buried him in Egypt. Now, think of all the things that if they hadn't happened, what would have happened in the future? So, if they hadn't have put Joseph in the pit and sold him into slavery, he never would have went to Egypt. If he never goes to Egypt, he never interprets the dream. If he doesn't interpret the dream, they're not prepared for the famine. And if they're not prepared for the famine, who's left? You see how that choice. So they meant it for evil, but who was ultimately in control? God was. Now, when I stress to you in this church, and all of you listening out there, because our brothers and sisters in other churches, they don't like the idea of the complete sovereignty of God over all things. I don't know why. It's pride, I guess. But I need you guys to be clear, because what they're going to tell you is that when we talk about the foreknowledge of God, they think that that means that God looks to the end of time to see what we do, and then he makes his choice. But that's not biblical at all. It's not God. What do we see in this story here? God has been in control of every bit of it. And to make it even crystal clear, when did God make this plan? Before he ever said, let there be light. Who were we? What did we learn Sunday morning, right? Does that make you trust him more and more? Every one of these lessons makes me trust God more and more, right? To see that he had his hand. And here's the beautiful part of it, when you look at the comparisons between Joseph and Jesus. And that was going to be some of my Q&A when I finally stop here. So I want you to try to come out and tell me some of the comparisons you see between Jesus and Joseph. If you can kind of let your mind go there and see some of the pictures, some of the foreshadowings or whatever, even back from the very beginning, what are some similarities when we talk about Jesus being his only begotten son, the preeminent son, right? See the comparison? His favorite son, right? Would you say that it's okay to say that Jesus is God's favorite son, right? Of course he is. He's that big word. Remember the big word, Jimmy? Prototokos, right? The preeminent one. Yeah. The Jehovah's Witnesses are going to knock on your door and say, Jesus, the Bible says he's the firstborn of many. Right? But he's not. Was Jesus born before John the Baptist? No. He's born after that. So they get things mixed up. That's why it's important to pay attention to these little things. Those big words like prototokos, I don't get all that stuff. Well, then you might get confused by the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons when they knock on your door. They might take your children and get them trapped in that satanic line, and you can't get them out of it. So it's important to know these things, right? So give me some comparisons that you've seen between Joseph and Jesus.